Hello and welcome to Foreign Exchange. I'm Hugh White from the Australian National University.
And I'm Sam Roggeveen from the Lowy Institute.
We'll start today talking about the rather strange transaction around Pat Conroy's comments that the submarine rotational basing in WA was going to come to an end in 2032, I think he said.
Now careful, you used the magic word there, you said basing.
Oh, rotational presence, is that what you meant to say?
The submarine rotational force.
That's right.
And well, the reason that the government avoids the word basing is exactly why we're talking about this subject,
yes, that's right. That's right, because the ALP, I think at the recent conference actually reaffirmed the policy that Labor's policy that it will not allow foreign military bases in Australia. Now this has become a bit of a fiction, I think, and they're behind the confusion that arose from Conroy's comments, which were quickly contradicted by Miles, obviously. Clarified, thank you. Obviously raised some concerns in Washington and confusion in Washington, is the whole peculiar position that Australia and the Labor government have got themselves into, whereby as a very big part of the whole AUKUS story, and behind the AUKUS story, the increasing engagement strategically with the United States in US efforts to respond to China's challenge in the Western Pacific, is the fact that there's a much bigger, more active US operational presence in Australia today than there has been at any time since 1945.
Yeah. And not just Submarine Rotational Force West, but of course it started in 2011 with the rotation, again there's that word, of Marines through Darwin. And also we're expanding the bomber base, the
bomber rotational
base,
facilities.
Yeah, the air base at RAAF Tyndall,
yes.
So that the Americans can base bombers there, B-52s, B-2s.
Operate bombers through there.
Thank you very much. I keep slipping in. Now the fiction of rotation rather than basing is necessary. Why? Well, maybe you can start on this topic.
Well, it's an old. It was an old Labor thing, of course, that going back into the 60s at least, and when the joint facilities were established in Pine Gap and Narungga and Northwest Cape, a very big part of Labor's framing of that was that these were joint facilities, not bases. And I remember when I had a big role in some of those things, one was forever correcting people when they talked about the spy bases, and we said no, joint facilities. And it was part of the kind of ideology that Australia, despite the fact we were a close ally of the United States, we still saw ourselves in a kind of sense as at least militarily non-aligned.
Yeah. And
it's hard now from where the alliance has come today to remember that for a long time Australian governments on both sides of politics actually were concerned to make sure that we manage down the depth of our strategic engagement with the United States, so it didn't complicate relations in the region. And that's something which, for at one level understandable reasons, as the region has become more contested, and the whole question of how the US maintains a strong strategic presence in the Western Pacific have become more vivid. That's gone by the wayside. Now, as we've discussed before, I think as a matter of fact, the rotational relocation of US strategic assets, military assets to facilities in Australia is actually an indication of the weakening of America's position rather than a strengthening, because it involves them pulling them further back from the prospective area of operations because they can't be protected where they are further forward. But it does mean that Australia moves further into the frame of has a higher priority in US operational planning. For a long time, the US had no interest in operation out of Australia because we were too far away, and that's changed.
I think historically also what's part of the reason for the differentiation over basing is that it meant that we are not Japan and we are not a European NATO country.
Yeah.
And we don't have that tight operational alignment. We don't operate hand in glove with the Americans. that's getting much, much harder to support.
Yes.
In fact,
Yes.
we're doing everything in our power to make sure that
Yes.
that we are
Yeah.
operationally
Yeah.
integrated, that we do have
Yeah.
the United States operating hand in glove with Australian
Yes.
forces
Yes.
from Australian soil
Yes.
on wartime missions
Yes,
if
that's
necessary.
right. Yes.
Another reason, I think what we're alluding to about the refusal to use the word basing is Labor Party domestic politics.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
the fact that, the almost, Stalinist level of information control over the last Labor Party National Conference is an indication of how nervous the government is about
Yes.
this sort of getting out.
Yeah.
And also an indication of how superficial support for AUKUS is, I think, within the government,
Yes,
within the party, I
Yes,
should say, not
yes,
within the government,
yes.
but within the Labor Party, and how tenuous that is. But there's another layer on top of this, which is the Treaty of Rarotonga,
Yes.
the South Pacific
Yes.
Nuclear Free Zone Treaty. And that treaty, to which Australia is a signatory, says that nuclear weapons shall not be stationed
Yes.
on the territory of any signatory to that treaty. And so we get around that by talking about a rotational arrangement. And as Mike Pezzullo, former colleague of yours, Deputy Secretary in the Defence Department, has helpfully pointed out in The Australian in recent weeks, come 2032 or thereabouts, the United States is going to be once again putting nuclear weapons on board its fast attack submarines.
Yeah.
And some of those fast attack submarines are going to be stationed, or I should say rotated
Rotationary.
through
Yeah.
SURF West, Submarine Rotational Force West at
Yes.
HMAS Stirling.
Yes.
So that raises a thorny problem for Australia.
Yes.
If
Yes.
those nuclear armed vessels are going to be rotated through HMAS Stirling, does that put us in breach of the treaty?
Yeah.
Well, if they're rotated, then at least in formal terms, we're not in breach of the treaty. In practice, in terms of the spirit of the treaty, you'd kind of think we are.
Yeah.
So, there's a question here about, does it really matter in terms of our relationship with the Pacific Islands region, whether we're in formal breach or not? I think that's actually a really important question. But the government at least seems to be settling for this workaround, this fudge of saying, well, they're not actually going to be based there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's important because, as we've talked about in previous episodes, the government has now spent several years tightening its embrace of Pacific Islands partners.
Yes.
And while you and I and members of the government may talk in very grand strategic terms about the contest between the US and China, and we may think in that respect that the Pacific Islands is small beer,
Yes.
it's clearly very important to them.
Yeah.
This treaty, the Treaty of Rarotonga, is very important to
Yes.
them. And should we, Australia, treat that treaty as a kind of afterthought, or not being, really secondary in our estimations, in our judgments about the grand strategic balance?
Yeah. No, I think that,
We may find that the kind of efforts we've been putting over the last few years amount to nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, look, I think that's a very fair point. There was always an element of fudge embodied in the Treaty of Rarotonga, the Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, because it was always important to the government to try and meet concerns in the South Pacific, originally, of course, around French nuclear tests, about keeping the Southwest Pacific nuclear free. And of course, that was a big part of how the Labor government at the time, that's in the 80s, squared what was then Labor Party reservations about our relationship with the United States as a nuclear power as the Cold War was ramping up into its sort of final crescendo in the mid-80s. So there was always an element of fudge about that word stationing, because we wanted to preserve our capacity for nuclear armed warship visits, for example, which was then a big deal. But so we're really just come back to that problem, but much more vividly, because, as you say, the level of our engagement, operational engagement with the US, has increased substantially, and we're not just talking about visits by nuclear armed vessels. We're talking about rotational operations. But I'd also just take the point a bit further, because although I think the point you're making about conforming with the Treaty of Rarotonga and what that means for our relations with the South Pacific is very important, it's also true that there's a bigger strategic question behind that, and that is to what extent we are, as a country, aware that what we're doing is putting ourselves in a position where if the United States does go to war with China, that will entail the United States conducting active military operations against the Chinese from our territory. Now that's in a sense a subsidiary question to the bigger question as to whether or not Australia should go to war with China. But even if we don't go to war, that will certainly be the Americans' expectations that our bases will be supporting the United States going to war. And that is itself a huge issue. I mean, and this is the issue that Mike Pezzullo has put on the table, I think, very helpfully. I mean, it's always worth bearing in mind that Mike Pezzullo, despite the peculiarities of his career in recent years, is a very serious strategic analyst. I disagree with him on a lot of the things he says, but he's one of the most serious strategic thinkers in Australia. He approaches this issue from the diametrically opposite end from me, because he thinks Australia should commit to supporting the United States in a war with China. But I agree with him that we certainly shouldn't be fudging this question. If, as we build up these rotational arrangements in WA and in the Northern Territory and so on, we are really embedding ourselves within active US operational planning for a war with China. That is something that we as a country really need to debate. The whole issue that governments are trying to step around by refusing to call these bases actually is a question we really need to talk about. And the contrast, the thing about NATO, for example, or Japan in the Cold War, was that those countries really did commit themselves in advance to actively supporting the United States in a war with the Soviet Union. We are similarly making the same kind of commitment to actively support the United States in a war with China. The difference is, in Japan and in NATO during the Cold War, they talked about it and they understood what they were getting themselves into. We're pretending it's not happening. And that's, I think, a very serious failure of public policy.
Yes. And I would argue that this issue, the basing issue, let's call it what it is more important than Australian acquisition of submarines under the AUKUS agreement. The weight of public debate is on the submarines.
Yes.
But to my mind, as it looks increasingly unlikely that we'll even get them.
Yes, yes.
Or at the very least that we'll get them extremely late. I would say the weight of public debate deserves to move to this question for all the reasons that you've put. I want to ask you another question about this, because in your earlier remarks you talked about the rotational force at HMAS Stirling as being part of an effort to pull back US forces so that they are less vulnerable to Chinese missile attack. I agree with that. But some of the commentary in the press, including in the Australian, and I'm forgetting who wrote this, but several commentators and analysts have talked about this idea that actually this is an asset, an Indian Ocean base that that the Pentagon in particular has wanted for a long time, and that it wants this for important operational reasons, not because it's pulling back, not because it's necessary, but because it's a huge asset, that it has then a permanent submarine force that can range out into the Indian Ocean, but also can more quickly and easily get to the South China Sea and work off the coast of China.
Yeah, I've heard that argument. I just don't buy it. I think a glance at the map explains why. Hawaii is as close to the key operational areas, Strait of Taiwan, as South Australia, as Western Australia is, as Perth is, and so I don't think there's a distinctive, operational advantage from that point of view, and I don't see US military requirements in the Indian Ocean being a compelling argument for establishing a facility in WA either. In fact, it's true that there's been a long story of the US Navy toying with the idea of trying to establish some kind of support capacity in WA. I remember all the way back in the 80s there was talk about that. In the end, they were never willing to pursue it because it never seemed like a high enough strategic priority to make it worthwhile. And I would say that's more true than ever now, because it's so obvious that America's principal strategic priority in what you might call the entire Indo-Pacific area, not a geographic concept or strategic concept I'm a fan of, but just for the purpose of this exercise, the overwhelming strategic priority is to maximise America's capacity to sustain a high rate of effort in the Chinese littoral.
Yeah.
And I don't think a submarine rotational facility in WA does anything to enhance that.
Yeah. One final point I want to discuss before we move on to our next topic is I've been wrestling a lot lately with AUKUS and its sheer dimensions and whether it's even useful now to debate AUKUS as if it's something that can be reversed. So on the submarines, for instance, we're $9 billion into this program now. I can't think of any other government project, not even a defence project, but any government project in Australia in which we've committed that many resources and then pulled out. Like even the French submarine contract, we were only $4 billion in when that was cancelled. We're now $9 billion in for the AUKUS submarine project. But the basing actually makes it even more entrenched. It may mean we've gone too far. For someone, you and I both believe in this idea of a much more self-reliant Australian posture, and over and above that, over and above defence policy, simply a more independent mindset for Australia as a power, as a middle power, and as a country that takes its proper place in Asian geopolitics. It is getting increasingly difficult to see how that is possible given the decisions that have been taken over the last few years. These are now taking on dimensions that I don't think I fully appreciated when they were made at the time.
Well, I do think you're right. I think, the thing about AUKUS is that it was always two things. That it was a submarine acquisition program and it was also a declaration of strategic alignment. And as you say, we're so far into it, the pulling out of it looks extraordinarily difficult. But pulling out of Australia pulling out of it's not how AUKUS will end. AUKUS will end because the United States pulls out of it when it decides that it can't spare the submarines, or when the British fail to deliver the SSN AUKUS because their submarine enterprise is completely dysfunctional. Or when Australia discovers that whatever we want to do, we can't take on US Virginia-class submarines because we don't have any submariners because the Collins class has run out of puff. So I think it'll be, so to speak, there won't be a sort of a free strategic decision made by an Australian government that we decide we don't want to proceed.
Yeah.
The process will have fallen apart and we'll have no choice. And that $9 billion, or however many more billions of dollars it is by the time we come to it, will have disappeared down the drain.
A sunk cost, so to speak.
A sunk cost.
But that doesn't get us to the basing.
And the sunk cost, well, I think, the basing will just fade away. I mean, the British aspect of the basing has faded away already.
Right.
I mean, there's never going to be a rotationally deployed British submarine operating out of WA. They just don't have any. I mean, they don't have a single submarine at sea, or attack submarine at sea at the moment, if you believe the current reporting. But the United States, I think, has very little reason. This is because what I said before. I don't actually think there's a strong strategic rationale for rotational operations out of WA from the US Navy's point of view, and it was always, I think, developed as a way of giving some early deliverables, some visible deliverables to AUKUS as what was essentially a diplomatic and political gesture. And I think, despite the fact that Australia spent a lot of money preparing for it, I think the US Navy's appetite for doing this, because it's hard and difficult for the US Navy to do this, I think the appetite for them to do it is going to fade away. Why for them keep on committing resources to operating out of WA when they can operate out of Hawaii?
Well, let's now talk about Vietnam, and the hook for this conversation is the visit, as we record, of General Secretary To Lam, who is the leader of the Vietnam Communist Party and therefore the president of Vietnam. He is in Australia right now, so we can't talk about what's being actually delivered from this visit, although, Hugh, maybe you'll chance your arm at a few predictions. But it's worth thinking about Vietnam as a country and as a partner for Australia. When I glance at some of the commentary preview commentary about this visit, I see a common theme describing Vietnamese foreign policy now as multi-directional, and this is very much standard practice, it seems to me, for Southeast Asia now, for ASEAN countries, to not commit to either side in this burgeoning competition, or at least as they see it, a competition between the United States and China, to keep both of them happy to some degree, to also, in Vietnam's case, to work with Russia and other great powers. And it allows, on the, you know, if you believe this idea of a multi-directional foreign policy, it gives middle powers some freedom of manoeuvre. It allows them to play great powers off against one another. I do think a lot about the limits of that. I mean, it sounds quite clever. It sounds like a chess move, but I think for middle powers there are some limits to how far you can take that. My other thought about Vietnam is that perhaps we in Australia underestimate its scale and its potential. I'm perhaps guilty myself of focusing, when I think about Australia and its relations with the region, of focusing almost solely on Indonesia. Now, I think that's for sound reasons of geography
look at the
and
map.
scale, but Vietnam's a country of over 100 million people. Its growth has been, over the course of this century, I checked this last night, the only period when its growth has been below 5% was during COVID. And other than that, it's been typically
5 to 8.
over 8 and sometimes 10. GDP per capita is already roughly the same as that of Indonesia. And it's going to grow much faster than Indonesia, which tends to go at about 5%. So it's going to become a wealthy and rich country. It's also a country which over the course of the 20th century saw off the French, the Americans, and then the Chinese in a border war. So this is a formidable player. And it's a nation that we shouldn't underestimate.
Look, I very much agree with that. I mean, to go back to your point before, I'm going to be bold and say nothing very significant will come out of Toe Lamb's visit to Canberra this week. But I do think Vietnam is a very interesting country and one we should be paying a good deal more attention to, partly because, as you say, the economics are interesting. Just actually last month it was declared by the World Bank to have reached upper middle income status, which is roughly 5,000 US dollars per head, GDP per head. And yeah, I mean, its economy has been growing. I mean, the figures I saw, it's oscillated between 5 and 8% of GDP growth, which is, you know, not China 10% per annum decade after decade, but it's pretty solid, and, you know, compounding over the years. So it is a substantial country. It's a significant trading partner for Australia. We're both within one another's top 15 trading partners, which is not stellar, but it's not nothing.
And a big Vietnamese diaspora in Australia.
350,000 is the number I saw, and that's pretty significant as well. We never
much bigger than Indonesia, by the way.
Yes.
About a third of that.
Yeah, and of course some of that dates back to 1975 and all of that.
Right.
But I think so. It's a significant player in that respect, but I also think it's a very significant player strategically and diplomatically. Precisely as you say, like Australia, it's trying to work out how it lives in a region in which China is either a very, very powerful country or the dominant power, depending on how you want to cut it. And of course, Vietnam approaches that from a very different position in Australia because it is contiguous. Right. Nothing beats a land border when it comes to an avenue for strategic pressure and influence. As they discovered when China taught Vietnam a lesson in 1978. So there's a real, it's a fascinating country to study, and exactly as you say, it has a formidable record in managing its relations with great powers without support from others. My working definition of a middle power is a country that can manage the pressure that a middle power can put on without the backing of another great power, and that is exactly what Vietnam has done. And that points both to the limits of Australia's alignment with Vietnam and the lessons we can learn from it. You know, in Vietnam they call it bamboo diplomacy. Very deep roots, very flexible.
Right.
You know, in 2024, Vietnam hosted Putin for a full-scale state visit. This is 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, To Lam turned up last year in Washington for a meeting of Donald Trump's Board of Peace.
Yes.
Now, you know, joining the Board of Peace is a interesting diplomatic gesture.
Yeah, which even Australia hasn't followed.
Well, exactly, exactly. You know, from To Lam's point of view, it was a cheap way of earning a bit of credit in Washington, and probably didn't take the implications of that for whatever's happening in the Middle East very seriously. So, you know, I think Vietnam is, if you're almost, I mean, as you say, it's a characteristic ASEAN position to avoid getting aligned with one side or the other. Very different from where we are in that respect, and because of their complex history, because of their geographical propinquity, you know, they are, if you like, the sort of the most vivid demonstration of how ASEAN's trying to achieve that. Particularly because they also have, I mean, not just a land border, but they also have the contested maritime claims in the South China Sea, and so I think there's a great deal to learn from Vietnam. You know, when Australians think about what it's going to be like to live in an Asia which is dominated by China if the United States fails, there's a bit of a sense of panic that, you know, by definition we're going to find ourselves under China's heel and unable to take our own path. What Vietnam tells you is that a country that plays its cards right, knows what it's trying to achieve, manages these things very carefully, you can actually maintain a significant degree of distance and independence, sovereignty. And so I think, you know, I think Vietnam is a country we should study very closely and try to learn from. The other thing is that To Lam himself is a bit of an interesting guy. He's an ex-copper. He spent his entire career in the politics, in the security side of Vietnamese life. He's been a very ruthless operator as a leader in the national security space. He's played an influential role in 2 previous presidents being thrown out. He also seems to have a very strong political and economic agenda. Since he became president, he's started a very significant transformation of Vietnam system of government, you know, ministries being abolished and merged and all that sort of thing, and has declared a kind of a new era in Vietnam's economic history, the sort of Doi Moi era that began sort of in 1986 with a move to market socialism as opposed to old-fashioned, you know, sort of Stalinist socialism. He's declared a new era of you know, national progress, which is meant to take Vietnam to being a high-income country by 2045, which I think is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the party.
I think that's right.
So, you know, he does seem to be not, so to speak, your average faceless Vietnam Communist Party apparatchik, but a bit of a leader with a capital L. And so it'll be interesting to see where he goes. He's also been very active diplomatically. I mean, you know, he's in the last few months, he's been to Beijing, he's been to Moscow, he's been to Washington. He's travelled a lot around the region and also to Europe, and so he seems to be seeing a more active Vietnamese diplomatic role. So he's, you know, this is a country to watch, and a guy to watch, and to that extent, you know, it's quite it's useful that his visit to Canberra reminds us of the fact that this is a country we should be paying a lot more attention to. Yeah,
and with all of that said, and also taking into account what I mentioned earlier about Vietnam seeing off 3 great powers in the second half of the 20th century, doesn't that invalidate or at least leaven some of the fears that you hear occasionally that, well, without the Americans in the region, China's going to be dominant?
Yes.
Why would a nation of such scale and such capability and such potential choose to subjugate itself to China in a post-American era?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think you know, the way I think about that is that, you know, we need to recognise how many different kinds of hegemony there are. You know, what we tend to think, I think in Australia, when we think of the kind of region we'd live in if the United States leaves and China so to speak left as the region's primary power, is that it looks something like, you know, Joe Stalin in Eastern Europe in 1950.
Right.
That is, so Russian people in every ministry in every country in the Eastern Bloc.
That's right, and essentially with the Soviet Union being able to control the national resources of the countries over which they had control.
Well, resources and policy and politics and the whole lot. That's not going to happen.
So Vietnam's not going to be Poland.
It's not
Cold War Poland.
It's not going to be Poland. It's not even going to be Hungary. It's a big, and apart from anything else, of course, because the Russians, the Soviets, could only adopt that position in Eastern Europe because of what happened in 1945. The Red Army was in occupation. What you see, actually, if you look through history, is that hegemony takes a lot of different forms and colours, and I've always thought a more useful model for the kind of Asia we'll live in if the United States leaves is that China will play something like the role the United States plays in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the United States is very influential in the Western Hemisphere, and there are limits to how far you can step out of line. But if you look at countries throughout the Western Hemisphere, they have a fair degree of autonomy. They do, they've got a lot of capacity to determine their national trajectory as long as they stay within reasonably broad bounds that the United States sets. Now, those bounds are a bit narrow with Donald Trump.
Yes,
but
or if you're Venezuela.
Yeah.
But of course, the difference, that's a useful illustration of your point, I think. Vietnam's not going to be Venezuela in this future. It's going to be more like Brazil.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is to say that there are clear limits to Brazil, to Brazil's room for manoeuvre in the international sphere. The clearest limit would be that no other great power can impinge upon America's sphere of influence. Yes. But within those strictures, they have tremendous room for manoeuvre. Venezuela, on the other hand, does not. Yeah.
And look, that's exactly right. And I think, the core lesson for Australia to draw from that is that, we shouldn't think that Australia could not find a way to live the kind of national life we want to live in a region which the United States is no longer playing a significant strategic role. Whereas I think the foundation of Australian policy at the moment is that we cannot imagine living in a region in which the United States doesn't play a significant strategic role, which, getting us back to our earlier subject, presupposes us to think that if the United States does end up having to go to war with China in order to preserve its significant strategic role in Asia through a Taiwan crisis, for example, then we should be supporting it.
Right.
Now,
because the alternative is unimaginable.
Because the alternative is unimaginable. Well, look at Vietnam and say, okay, but but also Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, you name it. That's South Korea, for that matter. Sure. That is the way in which these countries envisage their future. They say, we'd rather the United States stayed in Asia to balance China and limit its power. Of course they would, as should we. But what price are we prepared to pay in order to do that? Well, none of those countries are prepared to contemplate particularly aligning militarily with the United States against China, because they think in the end, if that's what they end up having to live with, well, they'll do it. And I think that kind of slightly more laid back and philosophical approach to the problem is something we should aim to emulate. Can I offer a recommendation?
Please.
My recommendation is an article in the Australian Naval Institute's weekly blog newsletter by a guy called Nathaniel England, who is a PhD student at the University of Warsaw, but nonetheless works on Australian defence policy. That's a bit interesting in itself. But he had a very nice piece in which he talked about the opportunity that Australia is offered by the fact that the Canadians, in their recent decision on their future submarine capability, decided to buy the German boat, the TKMS boat, rather than their competitor, the South Korean KAS 111 boat, which means that the Koreans have got some gaps in their production capacity. Now, the Canadians have done the process that we should have done. That is, they've gone through a proper competitive tender process between two very reputable builders. It's worth making the point the Koreans have emerged as very significant submarine builders in recent decades. They've done what we thought we were going to do. They have, over the last 25 years, built more or less from scratch a national submarine building capability. Of course, they start from the fact that they are the world's leading specialist shipbuilding company. The Chinese dominate ordinary shipbuilding, but if you want a specialist ship, something like an LNG tanker, for example, South Korea is where you get it built. So they've got a much stronger foundation than we have. The key thing about the Korean option is, just to note, is how cheap they are. You know, we're talking about a through-life cost for, and you know, the Canadians have got tender quality prices on this, through-life cost for 12 boats of $100 million. $100 billion compared to $368 billion for 8 boats under the AUKUS plan. You know, this is, to my mind, a much more cost-effective way of meeting our submarine thing. And I think Nathaniel, England's little piece really draws this out very nicely.
Well, my recommendation this week is James Curran's new book called Grand Ambition, Paul Keating's Global Vision for Australia. I don't think it'll have been released by the time this episode goes to air, but within a few days, if it's not out already, it will be within a few days. Now, disclosure, James is a friend of mine. I know and yours as well, so we're biased here, so you know, apply a discount to the recommendation, but I've already finished the book. I got an early copy.
You're very lucky.
It's fantastic. In relation to our previous discussion, I mean, James interviewed Paul Keating over a number of years, but in more recent years has talked to him about the kind of changes about AUKUS and the related changes that we talked about in the first part of this episode. And the reason that I mentioned earlier that I was becoming increasingly pessimistic about how we actually turn this around, if we should ever want to. One of the reasons for that pessimism is a quote that in the book from Keating. He says that the tight, and this is now, I'm quoting Curran rather than who's paraphrasing Keating, the tight embrace of the alliance in recent years represents, quote, a strategic disfigurement from which Australia cannot recover. You've made me slightly more optimistic in that regard, but still, it's a note of caution.